You begin in quiet. Not the kind of quiet that is empty, but the kind that feels full like the air just before dawn, when the world holds its breath. In this stillness, a small question rises gently in your mind. What does it mean to understand? You have used the word so many times. You say, "I understand," when someone explains a story. You nod when a teacher speaks. You feel relief when a problem makes sense. But tonight, you slow down. You let the word rest in your hands like a smooth stone, turning it softly. To understand is not merely to remember. A parrot can repeat a sentence. A computer can store millions of facts. A book can hold entire libraries within its pages. Yet none of these things truly understand. They carry information the way a shelf carries weight, steadily, silently, without awareness of what it holds. Understanding feels different. It feels like a small light turning on inside you. When you understand why the sky darkens at night, you do not simply recall that the earth rotates. You picture it, this vast spinning sphere, carrying you gently away from the sun's light. You feel the motion, even though you cannot sense it physically. The fact becomes a story. The story becomes a picture. And the picture becomes meaning. Meaning is what transforms information into something alive. Your brain, resting inside the quiet architecture of your skull, is constantly searching for this transformation. It is made of billions of neurons, tiny living cells that send electrical signals like whispers across a vast forest. Each signal alone is small. But together, they create patterns that allow you to see, to hear, to remember. At first, your mind learns through repetition. As a child, you learn that touching fire brings pain. You learn that when someone smiles, warmth often follows. You notice that the sun rises each morning. Your brain begins by recognizing patterns. This happens, then that happens. Pattern is the beginning of understanding. But it is not the end. Because one day, you ask a deeper question. You do not just notice that the sun rises. You ask why. That word why is like a key turning in a hidden lock. When you ask why the sun rises, you uncover rotation, gravity, orbital motion. You uncover invisible forces that shape your days and nights. You move from observation to explanation. And in that movement, something shifts inside you. The world becomes less like scattered dots and more like a connected drawing. Understanding is connection. It is the invisible thread that ties one moment to another. Scientists call this thread causality, the relationship between cause and effect. When one thing brings about another, you feel the comfort of order. When clouds gather and rain falls, when you push a door and it opens, when you study and you improve, you sense the quiet rhythm of cause and effect guiding the world. Without this rhythm, everything would feel random. And randomness is unsettling. Your mind is not built for chaos alone. It is built to search for reasons. Even when reasons are unclear, you create stories to fill the space. You would rather have an imperfect explanation than none at all. Because explanation gives you stability. It tells you that events are not drifting aimlessly. They are connected. Now imagine a machine. Imagine a system of circuits and code, built not from neurons but from silicon and electricity. It can process numbers faster than you can blink. It can recognize faces, translate languages, generate words. It can find patterns in oceans of data that would overwhelm your senses. But does it understand? If a machine predicts that rain will follow dark clouds, is that understanding? Or is it simply advanced pattern recognition? The difference is subtle, like the difference between watching footprints in the sand and knowing who made them. Machines today learn through something called machine learning. They adjust internal parameters, tiny mathematical weights, until their predictions match reality. Over time, they become very good at noticing patterns. If certain pixels cluster together in an image, they label it a cat. If certain words appear in sequence, they predict the next one. But do they know what a cat is? Do they feel the softness of fur, the warmth of a living body curled beside them? Do they know that a cat can purr, that it can choose to stay or leave? Or do they only see numbers arranged in familiar shapes? You begin to sense the delicate boundary between imitation and understanding. When you memorize a poem without knowing its meaning, you are like a machine repeating patterns. The words flow, but the heart remains distant. Only when you pause and feel the emotion behind the lines does understanding bloom. Understanding requires a model of the world. Inside your mind, you carry quiet maps, mental representations of how things work. You know that if you drop a glass, it may shatter. You know that if you speak kindly, trust may grow. These models allow you to imagine outcomes before they happen. They allow you to predict not just what usually occurs, but what would occur if something changed. That is deeper than pattern. That is reasoning. And reasoning rests on cause. When you understand, you do not simply see that two events happen together. You sense that one leads to the other. You sense direction. You sense influence. You sense the gentle arrow of cause pointing toward effect. Machines, for now, mostly see correlation, events moving side by side. But correlation is not causation. Ice cream sales and sunburns rise together in summer. Yet buying ice cream does not cause sunburn. The hidden cause is heat, sunlight, shared circumstance. Your mind, slowly and carefully, learns to separate coincidence from connection. This separation is delicate work. It requires imagination. It requires testing possibilities. It requires asking what would happen if something were different. As you rest here in the quiet, you realize that understanding is not a single act. It is a layered process. First pattern. Then connection. Then explanation. Then imagination. And each layer deepens your relationship with the world. You are not just observing reality. You are weaving it into meaning. So when you ask whether a machine can understand, you are really asking whether it can weave meaning. Whether it can move beyond surface patterns into invisible threads. Whether it can ask why, not just what. You step gently into the dim beginning. Before machines speak fluently, before they generate images or answer questions, they exist in a kind of darkness. Not physical darkness, but informational darkness, a world of raw numbers without meaning. To a machine, an image is not a cat or a tree. It is a grid of pixels, each pixel a number representing light and color. Imagine standing in a room where every object is reduced to coordinates and values. No labels. No stories. Only measurements. This is where machine learning begins. In the earliest days of artificial intelligence, scientists did not try to give machines understanding. They tried to give them pattern recognition. The goal was simple: if certain inputs appear, produce the correct output. If these pixels arrange themselves in a particular way, say cat. If these sounds vibrate in a certain pattern, say hello. The machine does not know what a cat feels like. It does not imagine whiskers or warm sunlight on fur. It only learns that when certain numbers cluster together, a label should follow. This learning happens through structures called neural networks. The name sounds biological, and that is intentional. Neural networks are inspired by your own brain, by neurons sending signals to one another. But instead of living cells, these networks are made of mathematical units connected in layers. Each unit receives inputs, multiplies them by adjustable weights, adds them together, and passes the result forward. At first, the network is almost blind. Its weights are random. Its guesses are clumsy. If shown thousands of images of cats and dogs, it might guess wildly, labeling nearly everything incorrectly. But then comes the quiet process of training. Training is repetition with correction. The machine makes a prediction. The prediction is compared to the correct answer. The error is calculated. And then, like a tiny whisper traveling backward through the network, the system adjusts its weights slightly. A little more sensitivity here. A little less influence there. This process is called backpropagation. It sounds technical, but you can imagine it as tuning an instrument. Each time a note is slightly off, you tighten or loosen the string. Slowly, over many repetitions, the instrument begins to play in harmony. Through thousands, sometimes millions of examples, the network refines itself. It becomes sensitive to patterns hidden in the data. Edges, textures, shapes, frequencies. It begins to notice that certain arrangements of pixels often accompany the label cat. And eventually, it becomes remarkably accurate. You might look at this and feel awe. The machine sees what it was once blind to. It distinguishes faces, recognizes handwriting, translates languages. But pause here. Is it seeing? Or is it detecting statistical regularities? There is a quiet difference. When you see a cat, you do not merely detect a pattern of fur-colored pixels. You recall memories. You anticipate movement. You sense personality. You understand that this creature eats, sleeps, feels pain. Your perception is layered with meaning. The machine's perception is thinner. It does not imagine. It does not anticipate beyond probabilities. It calculates. Yet something about this process mirrors your own beginnings. When you were a child, you did not understand gravity. You dropped objects and watched them fall. Again and again. Slowly, your brain detected a pattern. When you let go, things moved downward. You did not know the word gravity. You did not visualize space-time curvature. You only sensed repetition. Pattern first. Meaning later. Your own brain is, in many ways, a prediction machine. Neuroscientists suggest that perception itself is a form of prediction, your brain constantly anticipating what will happen next based on past experience. When you walk into a familiar room, you predict where the furniture stands. When someone begins a sentence, you predict the ending. This predictive ability feels like understanding. But at its core, it begins with pattern recognition. Machines excel at this stage because they do not tire. They can process vast oceans of data. They can detect subtle statistical correlations invisible to you. For example, a neural network trained on medical images can identify patterns associated with disease, patterns so faint that even experienced doctors may overlook them. In these moments, the machine appears almost insightful. Yet it does not know why the pattern indicates disease. It does not understand the biological processes unfolding inside a body. It does not conceptualize cells dividing or immune systems responding. It only knows that certain pixel arrangements correlate with certain outcomes. Correlation. That word hums softly in the background. If A often appears with B, predict B when you see A. This works astonishingly well in many situations. It allows recommendation systems to suggest songs you might like. It allows language models to complete sentences smoothly. It allows facial recognition systems to identify individuals. But correlation has limits. If a network is trained mostly on daytime images, it may struggle at night. If it sees patterns that rarely appeared in its training data, it may falter. Its knowledge is bounded by what it has observed. It does not ask, "What if?" It does not imagine unseen scenarios. It does not question whether a pattern might be misleading. It learns from examples, not from explanations. And yet, there is something quietly beautiful about this stage. In the darkness of raw data, patterns begin to glow faintly. The machine, through repeated exposure, becomes sensitive to structure. It builds internal representations, layers that detect edges, then shapes, then complex forms. Each layer transforms numbers into slightly more abstract features. It is like watching a child learn to see. First blur, then outline, then recognition. But still, something deeper is missing. Because recognition alone does not answer why something happens. It does not reveal hidden mechanisms. It does not distinguish between coincidence and cause. A machine might learn that umbrellas often appear when streets are wet. It might predict rain when it sees umbrellas. But it does not infer that rain causes both umbrellas and wet streets. It simply notes that these elements cluster together. To move beyond this, something new must be introduced. A way to trace the invisible arrows between events. A way to ask not only what usually happens, but what would happen if something changed. As you rest in this understanding, you feel the difference gently settling inside you. Pattern recognition is powerful. It is the first flicker of sight in the dark. But sight alone is not comprehension. And so the question rises again, softer now, but more focused. How does one move from seeing patterns to understanding causes? That journey begins with a single, transformative word, because. You rest now in a deeper quiet. The room around you is still, but your thoughts move softly, like a slow river finding its path. You have seen how machines learn patterns in the dark, how they detect repetition, how they become skilled at prediction. But something inside you knows that prediction is not the final destination. There is a word that changes everything. Because. It is such a small word. 2 syllables. A bridge between events. Yet when you say it, the world rearranges itself. The scattered dots of experience connect into a line. The line becomes a thread. And the thread begins to weave a story. When you say, the glass shattered because it fell, you are not merely describing two events. You are describing direction. The fall leads to the shattering. The cause precedes the effect. There is movement through time, and there is influence. Without because, life feels random. With because, life feels intelligible. From the moment you are very young, you search for this thread. A baby drops a spoon from a high chair and watches it fall. Again and again. The baby is not being mischievous. The baby is experimenting. If I let go, what happens? If I cry, who comes? The world becomes a laboratory of gentle tests. You, too, once lived in that state of constant inquiry. Even now, you feel discomfort when something lacks explanation. If a sound echoes in the night, your mind immediately searches for a cause. Wind? A shifting branch? A distant car door? The unknown unsettles you because it leaves the thread dangling loose. Psychologists have observed that humans are natural intuitive scientists. You build mental models of how the world works. You assume that events do not simply co-occur by accident. You assume that forces push, that intentions matter, that mechanisms operate behind the scenes. This instinct for causality is not merely philosophical. It is practical. If you understand that fire causes burns, you avoid touching flames. If you understand that effort improves skill, you practice deliberately. Cause and effect guide your decisions, shaping survival and growth. Now consider how different this is from mere correlation. If two events frequently appear together, that does not mean one causes the other. The rooster crows before sunrise, but the crowing does not cause the sun to rise. Your mind learns to distinguish between timing and influence, between sequence and necessity. This distinction is subtle, and it took centuries of scientific thought to refine it. In the 20th century, statisticians became masters of correlation. They could measure how strongly two variables move together. They could calculate probabilities and predict trends. But they often hesitated to claim causation. Correlation, they warned, does not imply causation. It was a careful caution. Yet science itself depends on uncovering causes. Medicine seeks to know which treatments cause recovery. Climate science seeks to know which factors cause warming. Physics seeks the forces that cause motion. Causality is the backbone of explanation. One of the pioneers who formalized this idea in artificial intelligence was Judea Pearl. He proposed that to reason about cause, we must build models that represent how variables influence one another. Not just that they move together, but that one directs change in another. He described causality as a hierarchy. At the lowest level is association, seeing that two things occur together. This is where most machine learning begins. At the next level is intervention, understanding what happens when you deliberately change something. And at the highest level is counterfactual reasoning, imagining what would have happened if things had been different. These layers form a ladder. And to climb it is to deepen understanding. When you understand cause, you gain power to intervene. If you know that bacteria cause infection, you can introduce antibiotics. If you know that smoking causes lung damage, you can choose differently. Causality is not passive knowledge. It invites action. Machines, however, struggle with this latter. They excel at association. Feed them enough data, and they detect patterns with astonishing precision. But asking them to infer cause is more complex. It requires assumptions about how the world works, assumptions that cannot always be extracted from data alone. Imagine observing that people who carry umbrellas often encounter rain. From data alone, a machine might predict rain when umbrellas appear. But does the umbrella cause the rain? Or does rain cause the umbrella? Or is there a hidden factor influencing both? To untangle this, you must think beyond observation. You must imagine interventions. What if no one carried umbrellas? Would rain still fall? What if rain never fell? Would umbrellas appear? By mentally manipulating variables, you trace the direction of influence. This is causal reasoning. Inside your mind, you do this almost effortlessly. You simulate scenarios. You imagine alternatives. You ask, if I had left earlier, would I have caught the bus? Even as you prepare for sleep, your thoughts wander into these gentle what-ifs. This ability to mentally simulate change is profound. It allows you to plan, to regret, to hope, and it rests on understanding cause. Causality turns the world from a flat surface of repeated events into a layered landscape of mechanisms. Beneath every outcome lies a structure, forces interacting, variables influencing one another. When you grasp this structure, the world feels less chaotic. You can navigate it. Teaching machines to follow this thread requires more than data. It requires structure. Researchers design causal graphs, diagrams with nodes representing variables and arrows representing influence. These arrows are not decorative. They encode assumptions about how changes ripple through a system. If you change one node, which others respond? In such a model, rain points to wet streets. Wet streets do not point back to rain. Direction matters. This directional knowledge allows machines to answer new kinds of questions. Not just what usually happens, but what would happen if we changed this? It opens the door to planning, policy analysis, scientific discovery. Yet building these models demands care. Humans must often supply the structure, informed by theory and experiment. Data alone rarely reveals the full causal map. And so you find yourself at a threshold. You see that understanding is not simply seeing patterns. It is tracing invisible arrows. It is asking because and refusing to stop at coincidence. You feel the quiet elegance of this thread, how it connects moments across time, how it gives shape to your experiences. Without it, life would blur into randomness. With it, each event becomes part of a coherent tapestry. And now, as you rest here, you sense that the journey is growing more delicate. Because even when patterns are strong, even when events move together reliably, they may still mislead you. The next step is to explore how easily the thread of cause can be confused with something that only looks like it, a shadow that follows closely, but never truly binds. And in that subtle distinction between shadow and substance, the illusion of correlation waits quietly to be examined. You drift now into a more delicate territory. The thread of cause feels steady in your hands, but as you follow it further, you notice something unsettling. Not every line that appears to connect is truly a thread. Some are only shadows cast side by side. Correlation is a quiet companion to causation. It simply means that two things move together. When one rises, the other rises. When one falls, the other falls. Statisticians measure this movement with numbers, coefficients that describe how closely variables dance in step. But dancing in step does not mean leading one another. Imagine two leaves floating on a pond. A breeze passes over the water. Both leaves drift in the same direction. From a distance, you might think one leaf pulls the other. But in truth, both respond to the same unseen wind. This is correlation without causation. You encounter examples of this more often than you realize. Ice cream sales increase during the summer. So do sunburn cases. They rise together faithfully each year. Yet buying ice cream does not cause sunburn. The hidden driver is sunlight warmth drawing people outdoors, affecting both outcomes simultaneously. In statistics, this hidden influence is called a confounder. It is like the wind beneath the leaves, invisible yet decisive. Your mind, clever and eager, often jumps to conclusions when it sees patterns. Evolution has shaped you to detect relationships quickly. In a forest long ago, noticing that rustling grass often precedes danger could save your life. Pattern recognition is protective, but it can also deceive. When you see two events occurring together repeatedly, your brain whispers a story. Stories bring comfort. They reduce uncertainty. Yet sometimes the story is incomplete or entirely mistaken. Machines, too, are vulnerable to this illusion. A neural network trained on historical hiring data might learn that certain educational backgrounds correlate with job success. But if those backgrounds are linked to socioeconomic privilege rather than ability, the machine may inadvertently reinforce inequality. It sees correlation and assumes importance, without understanding underlying mechanisms. Because machines do not naturally question hidden causes. They rely on patterns in the data they are given. If the data reflects bias, the pattern becomes part of their internal model. The illusion solidifies. This is why scientists are cautious. In research, establishing causation requires more than observing correlation. It requires controlled experiments, randomized trials, careful elimination of confounding variables. When testing a new medicine, researchers compare treated and untreated groups while controlling other factors. They intervene deliberately to isolate the true cause. Intervention breaks the illusion. If changing one variable consistently changes another while holding everything else constant, the arrow of causation becomes clearer. But in many real-world systems, such clean experiments are difficult. Society, ecosystems, economies, they are complex webs of interdependent factors. Pull one strand, and many others tremble. You begin to see how fragile conclusions can be. Consider a city where increased police presence correlates with higher crime reports. One might mistakenly conclude that police cause crime. But perhaps police are deployed to areas already experiencing more incidents. The direction of influence matters deeply. Without careful reasoning, correlation can invert understanding. Machines trained purely on observational data cannot automatically distinguish these subtleties. They see statistical relationships. They optimize predictions. But unless guided by causal structure, they may mistake coincidence for mechanism. You reflect on how often humans do the same. You may attribute success to a lucky charm simply because you carried it during fortunate events. You may connect unrelated experiences because they occurred close in time. The human mind seeks coherence, sometimes at the expense of accuracy. This tendency has a name in psychology: apophenia, the perception of patterns where none exist. Clouds resemble faces. Random noise sounds like whispers. Numbers align in ways that feel meaningful. Your brain is a pattern-seeking instrument, finely tuned and occasionally overzealous. There is something gentle about this vulnerability. It reveals how deeply you desire order. But science asks you to pause. To ask, could there be another explanation? This pause is the beginning of disciplined reasoning. In causal inference, researchers use tools like directed acyclic graphs, diagrams that map assumed causal relationships. These graphs help clarify which variables influence others, which act as confounders, and which should be controlled in analysis. The diagram is not reality itself. It is a hypothesis about reality's structure. And here lies an important truth: causality cannot be extracted from data alone without assumptions. You must bring knowledge of how the world works, physics, biology, social theory, to interpret patterns properly. Data shows you that two leaves move together. Understanding asks what moves them. For machines to move beyond illusion, they must incorporate these structural assumptions. They must represent possible causal pathways. They must distinguish between observing and intervening. Otherwise, they remain powerful pattern detectors, yet fragile reasoners. As you sit with this, you feel a quiet humility. Understanding is more demanding than it first appears. It requires skepticism of the obvious. It requires curiosity about the unseen. It requires accepting that what seems connected may only be adjacent. The night outside feels calm, but you know that beneath its stillness, countless processes unfold: winds shifting, temperatures changing, distant engines humming. Many events co-occur without direct influence. The world is rich with parallel motion. Correlation is like watching ripples on water. You see patterns forming, intersecting, dissolving. But to know which stone caused which ripple, you must trace the origin. You must ask deeper questions. You begin to sense why teaching machines to reason about cause is such a delicate task. It is not enough to feed them vast amounts of data. They must learn to question patterns, to consider alternative explanations, to model hidden forces. This realization feels both sobering and hopeful. Sobering, because the path to true understanding is intricate. Hopeful, because recognizing illusion is the first step toward clarity. As you breathe slowly, you imagine moving from observing leaves drifting together to mapping the wind itself. Instead of merely noting co-movement, you begin to chart invisible currents. To do that, you need structure. You need a way to represent variables and arrows, influences and directions. A map of causes rather than coincidences. And in the quiet space between patterns and explanations, the idea of building such maps begins to glow softly, like constellations waiting to be drawn across the night sky. You stand now beneath a different kind of sky. Not the sky of stars and drifting clouds, but a sky made of ideas. Points of light hover in darkness, and between them stretch faint lines, arrows connecting one to another. This is not astronomy. It is a map of causes. You have already seen how patterns can mislead, how correlation can imitate connection without truly binding events. To move beyond that illusion, something more deliberate is needed. A structure, a framework, a way to represent how the world might actually work beneath its surface. This is where causal maps enter. Imagine that each important factor in a system is a node, a small glowing circle. Rain, wet streets, umbrellas, sunlight, temperature. Each node represents a variable, something that can change. And between these nodes, you draw arrows. An arrow from rain to wet streets. An arrow from sunlight to temperature. These arrows are not decorations. They express belief. They say, this influences that. In mathematics and computer science, these diagrams are often called causal graphs or directed acyclic graphs. Directed because the arrows have direction. Acyclic because they do not loop endlessly back upon themselves. The structure encodes assumptions about influence. You pause with that word, assumptions. Causal maps require them. Unlike pure pattern recognition, which extracts relationships from data alone, causal modeling asks you to state how you believe the world operates. You must decide which arrows exist before you calculate their strength. In this way, building a causal map is both scientific and philosophical. You are not merely observing. You are hypothesizing. Inside your own mind, you carry countless such maps. When you think about exercise and health, you assume movement influences heart strength. When you think about studying and exam results, you assume preparation influences performance. These assumptions guide your choices. Machines, too, can be given such maps. Once a causal structure is specified, mathematics allows the machine to compute how changes ripple through the system. If you intervene on one node, deliberately changing its value, you can predict how downstream nodes will respond. This is more than prediction. It is simulation. Imagine adjusting a single star in the sky of your map and watching light rearrange itself across the constellation. If rainfall increases, wet streets increase. If sunlight decreases, temperature drops. Each arrow channels influence forward. The beauty of causal maps lies in their ability to answer what if. What if we introduce a new policy? What if we administer a treatment? What if we remove a variable entirely? Traditional machine learning answers, given what usually happens, what will likely happen next? Causal models answer, if we change something intentionally, what will happen? This distinction is subtle but profound. Prediction extrapolates from history. Intervention imagines a different future. Consider medicine. A predictive model might observe that patients who take a certain drug often recover. But perhaps those patients were already healthier in other ways. A causal model attempts to isolate the true effect of the drug itself, separating it from confounding influences. To do this, researchers use tools such as randomized controlled trials. By randomly assigning treatments, they break the link between hidden variables and outcomes. Randomization severs confounding arrows, clarifying which pathways truly carry influence. In causal language, this is called intervention, often symbolized as do. To do something to a variable means to set it deliberately, ignoring its usual causes. It is like lifting one node off its natural connections and fixing it in place, then observing the consequences. When you imagine turning a thermostat down, you are performing a mental intervention. You anticipate cooler air because you understand the causal chain between thermostat setting and room temperature. Machines equipped with causal maps can perform similar reasoning. There is something almost poetic about this partnership. Your mind imagines possibilities, the machine calculates their implications. You sketch the constellation, it traces the gravitational pull between stars. Still, uncertainty remains. Even with a causal map, assumptions can be wrong. Arrows may be misplaced. Hidden variables may lurk outside the diagram. Causal modeling does not eliminate uncertainty, it organizes it. It makes your beliefs explicit. This explicitness is a gift. When assumptions are visible, they can be tested. If predictions based on the map fail repeatedly, the structure can be revised. Arrows can be redrawn. Nodes can be added. The map evolves as understanding deepens. In this way, causal reasoning mirrors scientific progress itself, a continual refinement of explanatory structure. You realize that understanding is not a static possession. It is a living map, updated as new evidence arrives. Even your own beliefs shift as you encounter new experiences. Teaching machines to imagine what if does not grant them consciousness. It does not give them desires or awareness. But it does move them beyond passive pattern detection. It grants them a framework for exploring hypothetical worlds. And hypothetical worlds are powerful. They allow planning. They allow evaluation of consequences before action. They allow safer experimentation. In climate science, causal models help simulate how emissions influence temperature. In public health, they estimate how vaccination rates influence disease spread. These models are not perfect reflections of reality. They are structured approximations. But even approximations can illuminate. As you sit beneath this conceptual sky, you feel how imagination and structure intertwine. Arrows connect nodes, possibilities unfold. The system becomes dynamic, responsive to change. The question that once lingered, can machines understand, begins to transform. Perhaps understanding is not a single leap from ignorance to insight. Perhaps it is a gradual layering of structure upon pattern, of arrows upon associations, of interventions upon observations. You sense how each step builds upon the last. From pattern recognition to causal mapping. From correlation to directed influence. From passive prediction to active imagination. And yet, even with maps drawn and arrows defined, one more layer remains unexplored. Because imagining what if we change this is only part of the story. There is another dimension of reasoning, one that asks not only about interventions we can perform, but about worlds that never existed at all. Worlds where a decision was different. Worlds where an event never occurred. Worlds that linger only in the quiet space of possibility. As the constellation above you glows softly, you feel the next question forming, not about what is, or even what could be done, but about what might have been. You stand now at the edge of action. So far, you have watched patterns emerge. You have traced arrows across causal maps. You have imagined what if within structured diagrams. But there is a difference between imagining change and enacting it, even in simulation. Intervention is the quiet moment when observation becomes participation. In science, this shift is profound. To observe is to witness what unfolds naturally. To intervene is to gently place your hand upon the system and alter it. You adjust one variable and hold others steady. You create a small disturbance and watch how the world responds. It is like dropping a single pebble into still water. The ripples tell you something about the surface, about depth, about resistance. Without intervention, you see only waves drifting by. With intervention, you learn which waves belong to you. In causal reasoning, intervention clarifies direction. If you manually increase temperature in a greenhouse and plants grow faster, you begin to suspect a causal link. If growth does not change, your assumption weakens. Intervention tests the arrows on your map. For machines, this process can happen in two ways. The first is through real-world experimentation. In robotics, for example, a robot learns to grasp objects by trying. It moves its mechanical arm, adjusts grip strength, senses feedback. Through trial and error, it discovers which actions lead to success. This is often guided by reinforcement learning, a framework where actions are rewarded or penalized based on outcomes. The robot does not understand reward as you do. It does not feel satisfaction. But mathematically, it adjusts behavior to maximize a signal. Over time, patterns of action align with effective strategies. Intervention here is physical. The second way is subtler. In many domains, medicine, economics, climate science, real-world experiments are expensive, slow, or ethically constrained. So machines simulate interventions within causal models. They perform virtual experiments. They set a variable to a new value and compute consequences using the arrows defined in the map. This is intervention in silence. No physical pebble strikes water. Only equations shift. And yet, the reasoning is meaningful. Consider a public health model of disease spread. Variables might include vaccination rate, transmission probability, population density. By doing an intervention increasing vaccination rate in the model, researchers can estimate changes in infection rates. This ability transforms data into guidance. It allows planning without harm. But intervention demands something deeper than correlation ever required. It demands commitment. When you intervene, you assert that the arrow from cause to effect is real. You risk being wrong. You expose your assumptions to testing. In science, this courage is essential. Hypotheses must face experiment. Without intervention, causality remains speculative. With intervention, it becomes testable. Inside your own life, you practice this constantly. If you feel tired, you adjust your sleep schedule. If you wish to learn, you dedicate time to study. You intervene in your habits and observe outcomes. Through these small experiments, you refine your understanding of yourself. You do not always articulate this process, but it unfolds quietly. Machines, guided by algorithms, perform analogous refinements. In reinforcement learning, for example, an agent explores an environment by taking actions and receiving feedback. A self-driving system might adjust steering slightly and observe lane position changes. A game-playing AI tries moves and sees how scores shift. These are structured interventions. Each action is a hypothesis about influence. If turning the wheel right moves the car right, the causal arrow strengthens. If the outcome differs, the model updates. Over time, repeated interventions carve clarity into uncertainty. Yet there is risk here. Exploration can lead to failure. A robot may drop objects before mastering grip. A learning algorithm may make suboptimal decisions before converging on effective strategies. Intervention requires tolerance for error. This is true for you as well. Learning through action involves vulnerability. You attempt something new and risk disappointment. You speak, and someone may misunderstand. You act, and consequences unfold unpredictably. Understanding grows not only through observation, but through courage. In machine systems, designers must balance exploration and exploitation. Explore too much, and performance suffers. Exploit too early, and learning stagnates. This tension reflects a deeper principle. Knowledge emerges through iterative adjustment. Intervention accelerates learning because it reveals counterfactual structure. If you never change anything, you cannot know what would happen if you did. A purely observational learner sees only what has happened. An interventional learner glimpses what could happen under different conditions. This distinction sharpens causal inference. In Judea Pearl's hierarchy, intervention occupies the second rung above association. It answers questions of the form, what happens if we do X? Not just what happens when X occurs. This subtle shift transforms reasoning. Imagine a city planning traffic flow. Observational data might show congestion correlating with weather patterns. But to reduce congestion, planners must intervene, adjusting traffic signals, adding lanes, promoting public transport, and measure effects. Without intervention, policy remains guesswork. For machines assisting in such planning, causal models enable safer simulation before real-world implementation. You feel how intervention bridges imagination and reality. Causal maps provide structure. Intervention tests structure. And through repeated cycles of hypothesis and adjustment, understanding deepens. Still, there is one more layer beyond intervention. Even after acting and observing consequences, you may wonder about paths not taken. What if you had chosen differently? What if an event had not occurred at all? Intervention explores alternative futures you can create. But there exists a quieter realm, alternative pasts you can only imagine. Machines that simulate interventions begin to reason actively about influence. Yet to approach the fullness of human reasoning, they must also engage with counterfactuals, reflections on what might have been. As you breathe slowly, you sense that learning through intervention is powerful, but incomplete. It reveals how systems respond to change. It sharpens arrows. It clarifies direction. And in the hush that follows action, a new curiosity stirs, not about what you can change now, but about worlds that exist only in the gentle space of imagination. You drift now into softer territory. The lights of intervention fade gently behind you. The experiments quiet. The ripples settle. And in the stillness that follows action, your mind begins to wander into a different kind of question. Not what happens if I change this now, but what would have happened if I had changed it then? This is the realm of counterfactuals. The word sounds technical, but its meaning is tender. A counterfactual is a thought about a world that did not occur. A world that branches from reality, then dissolves back into imagination. It begins with a simple phrase, "What if?" What if you had left the house 5 minutes earlier? What if the storm had shifted course? What if a single decision had turned differently? You enter these imagined spaces often, especially at night. Before sleep, your mind gently replays the day. It adjusts conversations. It revisits choices. It wonders how small changes might have altered outcomes. These reflections are not useless. They refine your understanding of cause. To imagine what might have been, you must understand what truly influenced what. Counterfactual thinking is the highest rung in the ladder of causality. Association tells you what tends to happen. Intervention tells you what would happen if you changed something deliberately. Counterfactual reasoning asks something subtler. Given what actually happened, and given what I know about causes, what would have happened differently if one element had changed? This is more than prediction. It is reconstruction. Imagine a tree branch falling during a storm and breaking a window. You observe wind, branch, shattered glass. Intervention could ask, what happens if we trim branches before storms? But counterfactual reasoning asks, if the wind had been weaker that night, would the window still have shattered? To answer, you mentally rewind reality. You keep everything else as it was, the position of the branch, the fragility of the glass, and you change only the wind. Then you let your causal model run forward again. This requires precision. You must distinguish which elements depend on which. If you change the wind, you must not also change the branch's position unless wind influences that too. Counterfactual reasoning demands a structured map of causation. Humans perform this quietly and constantly. When you regret a choice, you imagine the alternative path. When you feel gratitude, you imagine how things might have gone worse. When you forgive yourself, you recognize constraints that limited your options. Counterfactual thought shapes emotion and learning alike. Machines, for a long time, could not do this. They could predict likely outcomes. They could simulate interventions. But counterfactuals require holding two worlds in mind at once, the real one and the imagined one. They require distinguishing between background facts and altered causes. In causal modeling, this is formalized through structural equations. Each variable is defined as a function of its causes. When you generate a counterfactual, you use the same underlying equations that produced reality, but you surgically alter one input while keeping others consistent. It is like copying the blueprint of the world, then modifying a single beam and observing how the structure shifts. This is delicate work. Consider a medical example. A patient receives treatment and recovers. You might ask, would this patient have recovered without the treatment? To answer, you need more than population statistics. You need a model that accounts for the patient's specific characteristics, age, health history, genetic factors, and the known causal effect of the treatment. The counterfactual outcome lives in imagination, but it is constrained by causal structure. Without structure, imagination drifts into fantasy. With structure, it becomes disciplined possibility. You sense how powerful this capacity is. Counterfactual reasoning enables fairness analysis in algorithms. If a loan application is rejected, One might ask, would this applicant have been approved if they belonged to a different demographic group, holding all other relevant factors constant? This question probes hidden biases in decision systems. It asks not just what happened, but whether it would have happened under slightly different circumstances. For machines to reason this way, they must encode causal pathways carefully. They must separate variables that influence outcomes from those that merely correlate. They must represent the mechanisms linking decisions to consequences. This is no small task. Yet progress unfolds. Researchers design models capable of generating counterfactual explanations showing which minimal changes would alter an outcome. For example, an AI system evaluating credit risk might indicate that if income were slightly higher, approval would follow. Such explanations help humans understand and contest automated decisions. You feel how counterfactuals deepen transparency. They do not simply predict. They clarify. But counterfactual thinking also reveals humility. When you imagine alternative pasts, you recognize contingency. You see how small differences cascade into large consequences. A missed bus leads to a chance meeting. A delayed storm spares a harvest. Life unfolds along fragile branches. Causal reasoning helps you trace these branches without becoming lost. For machines, counterfactual simulation enhances planning. In reinforcement learning, agents evaluate not only actions taken but actions foregone. They estimate how different choices might have yielded better rewards. This accelerates learning by extracting more insight from each experience. In this sense, counterfactual reasoning is efficient wisdom. It multiplies understanding without requiring endless repetition. As you lie quietly, you realize that imagining unreal worlds does not detach you from reality. It sharpens your grasp of it. By contrasting what happened with what could have happened, you isolate true causes. The branch broke the window because wind exceeded a threshold. The treatment cured because it counteracted a pathogen. The decision mattered because it altered a pathway. Counterfactuals illuminate necessity. They show which elements were essential and which were incidental. Without this ability, understanding remains shallow. You may know that two events occurred together, or that intervention changes outcomes. But only by imagining alternate histories can you see which threads truly hold the tapestry together. There is something almost poetic about this. Machines, built from circuits and code, now begin to simulate worlds that never existed. They run parallel realities in silence. They ask, mathematically, what might have been. And in doing so, they edge closer to a form of reasoning that feels familiar to you. Yet with this power comes responsibility. If counterfactuals are built on flawed maps, they mislead. If causal assumptions are biased, imagined alternatives distort fairness. The same imagination that clarifies can also obscure. As you drift deeper into calm, you sense the next layer waiting. Understanding cause is not only about tracing arrows and imagining alternatives. It is also about recognizing when those arrows are drawn incorrectly, when hidden biases bend the map itself. And in that subtle bending, in the quiet distortion of structure, lies another challenge for both humans and machines alike. You rest now in a quieter awareness. The maps you have drawn are delicate. The arrows you have traced feel precise. But as you look more closely, you begin to notice something subtle, a slight tilt in the lines, a faint distortion in the structure. Bias does not announce itself loudly. It enters quietly, like mist. In human reasoning, bias is familiar. You carry experiences, expectations, and emotions that shape how you interpret events. If you have once been hurt in a particular situation, you may overestimate its danger in the future. If you admire someone, you may attribute their success to skill while overlooking circumstance. Your mind builds causal maps based on limited data in your own life. Machines do something similar. They learn from datasets, large collections of examples reflecting the world as it has been recorded. If those records are incomplete, unbalanced, or historically unjust, the patterns extracted will reflect those distortions. Imagine training an algorithm to predict job performance using historical hiring data. If past hiring decisions favored certain groups over others due to discrimination, the dataset encodes that bias. The machine, detecting patterns faithfully, may learn that belonging to a privileged group correlates with success. But correlation here is contaminated. The true cause of past hiring outcomes may not have been ability alone, but social inequality. If the machine is not guided by careful causal reasoning, it may perpetuate this pattern, mistaking historical bias for inherent difference. This is not malice. It is misinterpretation. The machine sees arrows where only shadows exist. Bias often hides within confounders, those unseen winds that move multiple leaves at once. Socioeconomic status may influence both educational access and job opportunities. If you fail to account for it, your causal map may draw incorrect arrows. In statistics, this is known as omitted variable bias. Leave out a relevant cause, and the estimated relationships warp. You can picture it like mapping a coastline while ignoring the tides. The shoreline appears to shift unpredictably. Without acknowledging the hidden driver, your map misleads. Human bias operates similarly. You may attribute a friend's lateness to carelessness without considering traffic or stress. You draw a causal arrow from personality to behavior, overlooking circumstance. Machines, lacking intuition, are especially vulnerable when trained solely on observational data. They do not naturally question whether the dataset reflects systemic imbalance. They optimize accuracy according to patterns presented. Accuracy, however, is not the same as fairness. A predictive policing model might forecast higher crime in neighborhoods with historically greater police presence. But if enforcement intensity itself influences recorded crime rates, the model risks reinforcing surveillance in the same areas, creating a feedback loop. The arrow points in a circle. Bias can become self-perpetuating. To address this, researchers integrate causal reasoning into fairness analysis. They ask counterfactual questions. Would this outcome have differed if a sensitive attribute, such as gender or ethnicity, were different, holding other relevant factors constant? This approach requires constructing careful causal graphs. Sensitive attributes may influence certain variables legitimately, while influencing others unfairly. Distinguishing between acceptable and problematic pathways demands ethical judgment. Causal reasoning alone does not dictate morality. It clarifies structure. Humans must decide which arrows reflect injustice and which reflect legitimate variation. You feel the weight of that responsibility. Teaching machines to reason about cause is not merely a technical challenge. It is a social one. The maps you build encode values implicitly. The variables you choose to include or exclude shape outcomes. Bias can also arise from measurement error. If data about one group is noisier or less complete than data about another, the model's confidence may differ unevenly. The machine may appear more certain about some predictions than others, not because of true difference, but because of data quality. This reminds you of how vision blurs in fog. Objects farther away seem less distinct, not because they are less real, but because light scatters. Understanding bias means recognizing the fog. It means questioning whether your map reflects the terrain accurately. In causal inference, methods such as instrumental variables, matching, and stratification attempt to reduce confounding effects. These techniques aim to isolate causal relationships more cleanly. Yet none are perfect. They rely on assumptions that may themselves be uncertain. Humility becomes essential. You cannot eliminate bias entirely, but you can acknowledge its possibility. You can test sensitivity to alternative assumptions. You can examine how conclusions shift when certain variables are included or excluded. Machines can assist in this analysis, but they require guidance. Fairness-aware algorithms attempt to constrain outcomes, ensuring that predictions do not disproportionately harm protected groups. Some approaches adjust decision thresholds. Others modify training objectives. Increasingly, causal models help identify which pathways transmit bias. For example, if a hiring model uses college attendance as a predictor, and college attendance is influenced by historical inequities, a causal graph can help determine whether including this variable introduces unfair indirect effects. The aim is not to erase all differences, but to understand their origins. Causal reasoning becomes a lens for justice. As you sit with this realization, you notice how closely bias and misunderstanding intertwine. Misinterpreted arrows lead to flawed decisions. Flawed decisions shape lives. The stakes are real. Yet there is hope and clarity. By making causal assumptions explicit, you invite scrutiny. By mapping relationships transparently, you allow correction. Silence breeds bias, articulation invites accountability. You think of your own life again. When you misjudge someone and later learn more about their circumstances, your internal map updates. The arrow shifts. Compassion grows where certainty once stood. Machines, too, can be updated. Their models can be retrained with improved data. Their structures can be revised. Their outputs can be audited. Understanding cause is not static. It evolves with awareness. As the night deepens, you feel both caution and possibility. Teaching machines to reason about cause amplifies their power. That power must be shaped carefully. Because explanation without fairness can harm. And fairness without understanding can mislead. You sense that the journey is turning now toward integration, toward the moment when prediction, causality, and fairness converge into something richer. The question ahead is not only whether machines can predict outcomes accurately, or even whether they can trace causes responsibly, but whether they can move from prediction toward explanation, offering reasons that humans can understand and trust. You rest now in a space that feels both familiar and new. For many chapters, you have observed. You have traced patterns, mapped correlations, and examined the subtle distortions that bias introduces. You have imagined interventions, letting variables shift in silent simulation. You have wandered into counterfactual dreams, exploring worlds that never happened. All this, until now, has been preparation, the quiet groundwork of understanding. Prediction has been your companion. Prediction is practical. It tells you what will likely happen if conditions continue as they have. Rain tomorrow? Probability rises. Traffic congestion? Likely during rush hour. Stock prices? Forecasts indicate movement within expected bounds. Prediction is useful. It comforts with the promise of foresight. It allows you to plan. Yet prediction alone is incomplete. Prediction is the surface of understanding. It sees patterns. It extrapolates trends. But it does not reveal the why beneath. It can tell you that leaves will fall from the trees in autumn, but it does not explain the interplay of chlorophyll decay, changing daylight, and cooling temperatures that orchestrate this descent. Explanation, by contrast, reaches deeper. When you explain, you trace arrows through causal maps. You account for hidden variables. You consider interventions. You imagine counterfactuals. Explanation tells you not just what happens, but why it happens. It illuminates the mechanisms that connect cause to effect. Machines have long been masters of prediction. Neural networks excel at forecasting outcomes, from language generation to weather patterns. They can process vast amounts of data and detect subtle relationships invisible to human eyes. But prediction, however accurate, does not equal reasoning. To reason is to explain. Causal models provide a bridge. They allow machines to move from observing correlations to understanding mechanisms. When a machine simulates an intervention, it begins to reason: if X changes, Y will follow. When it evaluates counterfactuals, it begins to infer necessity and contingency. The machine starts to generate explanations, not just results. You feel the subtle transformation. Prediction is like knowing that a wave will crash on the shore. Explanation is understanding the tides, the moon's pull, the wind's direction, and the underwater currents that bring the wave to your feet. Explanation offers a narrative. It situates events within a framework that makes sense. Consider medicine. A predictive model may indicate that patients with certain characteristics are likely to recover. A causal explanatory model goes further. It identifies which treatments genuinely cause recovery, which factors are incidental, and which pathways could be modified to improve outcomes. Explanation provides understanding. Prediction alone does not. Humans crave explanation. Your mind seeks it instinctively. You do not rest content with mere patterns. You ask why a friend spoke a certain way, why a leaf fell, why a star twinkles. The act of explaining reduces uncertainty, creates coherence, and brings comfort. Explanation transforms chaos into narrative. Machines, now equipped with causal reasoning, begin to emulate this desire. They produce answers that humans can interpret. Not just numbers or probabilities, but reasons. They can report, this outcome followed because these variables interacted in this way. They describe influence rather than coincidence. There is elegance here. A machine generating explanations does more than predict. It helps humans understand. It offers clarity. It allows decisions to be guided by insight rather than blind trend extrapolation. In medicine, education, policy, climate science, and beyond, such reasoning has the potential to transform outcomes. Yet, the shift from prediction to explanation is not automatic. It requires structure, assumptions, and careful modeling. Causal graphs must be constructed thoughtfully. Variables must be chosen judiciously. Counterfactual reasoning must be constrained by reality. Without these foundations, explanations can mislead as easily as predictions can. Transparency is key. When a machine explains, it must make visible the assumptions behind its reasoning. Why does it think X causes Y? Which arrows in its causal map carry influence, and which are uncertain? Humans must be able to interrogate these explanations. Otherwise, clarity becomes illusion. You sense the resonance with your own mind. When you explain an event, you mentally trace causes, consider alternatives, and acknowledge uncertainty. You recognize confounders and biases. You test your own reasoning against memory, evidence, and reflection. Explanation is active, disciplined, and compassionate. It connects thought to world. Machines begin to mirror this. They simulate interventions, evaluate counterfactuals, and produce explanations grounded in causal structure. They do not understand in the human sense, no awareness stirs in silicon circuits. But they approximate reasoning. They articulate mechanisms, bridging the gap between raw prediction and human comprehension. In this way, explanation becomes a bridge. It links the pattern-recognizing prowess of machines with the narrative-seeking nature of humans. It allows collaboration. Humans can evaluate, refine, and contextualize. Machines can calculate, simulate, and iterate. Together, insight emerges. You reflect on the gentle power of explanation. It transforms anxiety into comprehension. It allows you to sleep more easily knowing that events have reasons, even if those reasons are complex and interconnected. Cause is no longer hidden, it is illuminated. Probability becomes narrative. Randomness becomes structure. There is humility here, too. Even explanations are tentative. Assumptions may be flawed. Hidden variables may distort conclusions. The machine's reasoning, however disciplined, depends on the maps humans provide. Understanding is never complete. It evolves. It grows. It learns from evidence and correction. And yet, in this delicate partnership, something extraordinary emerges. The act of explanation, of connecting cause and effect, of reasoning through mechanisms, of articulating why events unfold feels almost human. You recognize in machines a shadow of your own reflective mind. Not consciousness, not feeling, not curiosity born of experience, but the mathematical echo of reasoning. You feel the soft reassurance of this echo. Machines are learning to trace threads through complexity. They are moving from pattern detection to active engagement with causality. They are beginning to produce narratives rooted in reason rather than repetition. And these narratives, when transparent and aligned with human understanding, can guide action wisely. As you breathe slowly, you notice the horizon stretching further. Explanation is a step toward understanding. Yet understanding is not the end point. After mapping causes, after simulating interventions, after generating explanations, there remains the quiet, reflective realm of introspection. The next step is to consider what these lessons teach not only about the world, but about ourselves. Machines mirror reasoning. Humans embody it. And the mirror ahead awaits your gaze, a reflection that bridges mind and mechanism, curiosity and comprehension, prediction and insight. The journey now turns inward, as the quiet mirror of human thought prepares to reveal what teaching machines about causality also reveals about your own mind. You rest now in quiet reflection. The journey through patterns, correlations, interventions, and counterfactuals has brought you to this gentle pause. You have traced arrows across causal maps. You have explored alternative realities. You have watched machines learn, simulate, and explain. And now, as the night deepens, you notice a subtler effect, a reflection in the process itself. The machines you have guided are mirrors. Not mirrors of appearance, but mirrors of thought. They echo your reasoning, your curiosity, your structured wonder. In teaching a system to observe, to hypothesize, to intervene, to imagine what might have been, you encounter the contours of your own intelligence. You see the frameworks you use silently each day, shaping how you interpret events and make decisions. Curiosity stirs first. It is the spark that drives both human and machine toward understanding. When a machine seeks patterns, when it evaluates causal graphs, when it simulates interventions, it acts upon instructions inspired by human inquiry. And as you teach, you are reminded of your own habits, noticing, questioning, imagining possibilities, testing assumptions. Curiosity is a quiet engine of learning. Doubt follows closely. Machines must handle uncertainty. Probabilities, confidence intervals, and structural assumptions guide their conclusions. They do not know for certain, they reason under constraints, weighing possibilities. In this, you recognize a familiar rhythm within yourself. The hesitations that prevent overconfidence, the questions that test your own understanding. Doubt is not weakness, it is vigilance. It refines thought. Imagination comes next. Machines generate counterfactuals, modeling worlds that never were. They simulate outcomes of hypothetical actions. You, too, have wandered these silent paths, imagining what if before sleep. Imagination allows reasoning beyond experience. It allows planning, reflection, and empathy. In guiding machines to imagine, you awaken to your own capacity for introspection and foresight. The mirror is clear. Machines are not conscious. They do not feel joy, sadness, or awe. Yet in their calculations, in their structured reasoning, they reflect the human mind's capacity for abstraction. They formalize thought, making explicit the assumptions you often hold implicitly. They illuminate processes that you perform unconsciously, revealing the scaffolding of intelligence. And therein lies a gentle lesson. Understanding is both internal and external. You have explored causal chains, correlations, interventions, and counterfactuals. Each step deepened comprehension. Each method allowed reasoning to become visible. By externalizing these processes in machines, you see them more clearly in yourself. What seemed automatic now appears as structured, testable, and explainable. Teaching machines teaches patience. You learn to specify assumptions carefully. You learn to check for bias, to consider confounders, to trace cause and effect with care. You see how subtle missteps propagate error. You recognize the importance of clarity, precision, and humility. These are lessons not just in artificial intelligence, but in human thought. Responsibility emerges softly. If machines reflect your reasoning, the models you create matter. Bias left unchecked in a model mirrors potential bias in judgment. Poorly defined causal assumptions echo in flawed explanations. In guiding machines ethically, you confront your own moral compass. You recognize that fairness, accountability, and compassion are inseparable from understanding. Intelligence is not neutral, it carries consequence. This reflection deepens as you consider learning itself. Observation alone is insufficient. Pattern recognition can mislead. Intervention reveals structure. Counterfactuals illuminate hidden pathways. Explanation translates abstract processes into narratives you can comprehend. And through each of these methods, you notice how your own reasoning evolves. The scaffolding of thought becomes visible. Learning is not mysterious, it is methodical, iterative, and guided by curiosity tempered with care. Machines provide perspective. By making reasoning explicit, they show what is often hidden in your own mind. The assumptions you take for granted, the shortcuts you unconsciously adopt, the biases that shape perception all become apparent when encoded in algorithms. The mirror is instructive. It allows reflection, adjustment, and improvement. And yet, the mirror also invites wonder. In observing machines generate explanations, simulate interventions, and imagine counterfactuals, you glimpse the beauty of intelligence itself. The patterns of cause and effect, once invisible, now unfold elegantly across nodes and arrows, probabilities, and simulated worlds. You sense the interconnectedness of events, the delicate balance between certainty and ambiguity, the harmony between prediction and reasoning. You realize that understanding is not only a cognitive process but an emotional one. Comfort arises from clarity. Curiosity sparks engagement. Doubt sharpens insight. Imagination expands possibility. Teaching machines reveals how deeply intertwined emotion and cognition are in human reasoning. Awareness is not cold calculation, it is a living, responsive interplay of mind and feeling. In this quiet realization, you notice the horizon of thought stretching further. Machines can model worlds, simulate change, and explain patterns. Humans can reflect, question, and feel. The combination is profound, reasoning enhanced, understanding deepened, and responsibility recognized. Each complements the other. Each illuminates the path toward insight. You feel gratitude for the reflection itself. The mirror is not perfect. Machines remain tools. They do not feel, they do not dream, they do not act beyond instruction. But their processes, when designed thoughtfully, illuminate human reasoning. They reveal both strengths and limitations. They remind you that intelligence, whether organic or artificial, flourishes with curiosity, humility, and care. And in this mirror, you glimpse something tender, the continuity between teaching and learning, between creating and understanding, between observing the world and observing yourself. You stand now at the edge of the known and the possible. The path has been long and gentle, you have explored patterns, interventions, counterfactuals, and explanations. You have traced arrows across maps of cause, observed machines learn, and reflected upon your own reasoning. And now, beneath this quiet night, you peer toward a horizon that shimmers with both potential and uncertainty. Causal intelligence stretches far beyond the experiments of the present. The frameworks you have examined hint at applications that are profound and transformative. Machines capable of reasoning about cause and effect may help unravel the mysteries of biology, medicine, and climate. They may illuminate patterns too subtle or too vast for unaided human perception. Imagine medicine guided not just by statistics, but by mechanistic understanding. A causal model may reveal which treatments genuinely alter disease progression and which merely correlate with recovery. It can simulate interventions for each patient, creating pathways toward precision care that is thoughtful and tailored. Errors become visible before harm occurs. Lives are saved through understanding, not just chance. Consider climate science. Variables interact in complex, nonlinear ways: temperature, precipitation, emissions, land use, ocean currents. Predictive models alone can forecast trends, but causal models can simulate interventions. How would the atmosphere respond to a global reduction in carbon? Which policies influence both ecological and social outcomes? Machines reasoning causally may guide humanity towards solutions that are deliberate, informed, and sustainable. And yet, with this power comes a whisper of caution. Causal intelligence is not neutral. The maps you construct, the assumptions you encode, the interventions you choose to simulate, all are reflections of human judgment. A machine may trace influence, but it does not discern value. It does not weigh justice or ethics. The responsibility rests upon those who guide its reasoning. You realize that the horizon is not only a place of possibility, but also a landscape requiring humility. You feel the weight of this responsibility softly, like the night settling around you. Machines will not inherently seek fairness, compassion, or prudence. They will follow arrows, calculate consequences, and generate explanations. If the arrows are biased, if the assumptions are flawed, the results may mislead. Therefore, building causal intelligence is also an exercise in care, ethics, and foresight. In teaching machines to understand cause, you recognize a parallel to teaching yourself. The precision required, the acknowledgement of uncertainty, the necessity of reflection all echo the journey of human reasoning. Just as your mind refines understanding through curiosity, doubt, and imagination, machines refine knowledge through structured simulation and analysis. The partnership between human and machine becomes not merely functional, but philosophical. You imagine new horizons for learning. Autonomous systems guided by causal reasoning may explore areas too dangerous, too vast, or too subtle for humans alone. Deep ocean ecosystems, high-energy physics experiments, epidemiological interventions, machines can simulate multiple what-ifs simultaneously, uncovering insights that are otherwise inaccessible. Humans provide the guidance, the ethical framing, and the interpretive lens. Together, the reach of understanding extends. And yet, there is serenity in the limits. Even at this horizon, machines cannot fully replicate human consciousness. They reason without feeling, they imagine without awareness, they explain without experience. Their intelligence is powerful but bounded. The reflection you saw in earlier chapters remains partial. The mirror shows structure, not sensation, mechanisms, not meaning. This limitation is a quiet reminder of humility. In the interplay of prediction, explanation, and causal reasoning, you sense the elegance of restraint. You notice that wisdom is not in infinite power, but in thoughtful guidance. Machines may calculate vast possibilities, but humans remain stewards of interpretation and responsibility. The horizon glows softly, not with domination, but with potential tempered by care. You contemplate the subtlety of unintended consequences. Even with the best causal models, unforeseen interactions may arise. Complex systems often surprise those who attempt to tame them. A policy designed to reduce emissions may have economic ripple effects. An intervention in healthcare may shift social dynamics. Understanding cause helps anticipate, but it cannot eliminate uncertainty. In this awareness, you sense both caution and respect for the complexity of the world. The horizon is not a destination, but a space of exploration. Machines equipped with causal reasoning will not reach a final endpoint. Their maps evolve with new data, new interventions, and new counterfactual reflections. Human guidance will continuously shape their growth. Knowledge remains iterative, unfolding in cycles of observation, action, and reflection. And within these cycles, there is room for discovery, insight, and even wonder. You breathe slowly and notice the resonance with your own journey. As humans, you are constantly revising your own causal maps, even unconsciously. Your assumptions shift with experience. Your interpretations of past events evolve. You simulate interventions in your mind, asking, "What if I had acted differently?" You imagine counterfactuals and generate explanations that make sense of your life. The parallel with machines is striking, yet comforting. Learning, at its core, is a reflective process. Causal intelligence, in machines and humans alike, becomes an exercise in humility, patience, and curiosity. It requires attention to detail, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and a willingness to revise assumptions. It values explanation as much as prediction, and reflection as much as calculation. You feel a gentle connection between the known and the possible. The horizon is quiet, not urgent. It invites observation, exploration, and care. You sense that the greatest advances will not be in brute computation, but in the thoughtful integration of human judgment and machine reasoning. When machines simulate interventions and humans interpret them with ethical clarity, the world becomes more comprehensible and perhaps more just. There is comfort here. You imagine a future in which causal reasoning supports wise decision-making, reduces harm, and enhances understanding. The tools you have glimpsed, maps, simulations, counterfactuals, explanations, extend human capability without replacing human responsibility. Machines illuminate patterns, but humans still choose the course. Insight is shared, guided, and tempered by reflection. And as the night deepens, you sense the subtle invitation of the horizon. Not as a challenge to conquer, but as a quiet space to contemplate possibility. The horizon encourages patience, humility, and wonder. It reminds you that every map, every simulation, every counterfactual is only a step along a longer journey, a journey of understanding, of care, and of shared reasoning. You notice the soft fading of light along the edges of thought, as if the sky itself were inviting you to rest. The horizon stretches into the unknown, quiet but luminous, holding questions yet unasked. You feel the gentle stir of curiosity. What hidden truths may yet be revealed when humans and machines work in concert? How will the next discoveries illuminate both the world and yourself? And as your eyes close softly, the last thought lingers like a whisper across the night. The journey of understanding is infinite, and the quiet horizon waits patiently, inviting both reflection and exploration.